Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. My name's Andrew Lawton, and it's great to have you joining me on the show today. So thank you so much for lending the next however long this takes to me. I greatly appreciate it. And it's funny because this week is a new week in Canada. A new week forward, a new path ahead, and it is the official start of the time of Trudeau. Justin Trudeau's premiership started on Wednesday of this week. He is no longer Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. He's no longer Prime Minister designate Justin Trudeau. He's no longer Premier Ministre désigné Justin Trudeau. He is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And I want to make a couple of things very clear about this. I offer my sincere and heartfelt congratulations to him and to his family. This is a big deal. I ran into, just a few days before the swearing in, actually, one of the new Liberal members of Parliament who had been elected but not yet sworn in. And I said to her, even though obviously I didn't want her to win, I said, congratulations. And she knew I meant it, and she thanked me, and I did mean it. Congratulations to someone in that position who's been entrusted with that much power and history is, in fact, a big deal. But that does not mean that the work does not start now in being what I have dubbed myself, anyway, the official opposition of Justin Trudeau's premiership. And that is something that I think we need to spend more attention doing, not just complaining during elections, but talking about this as a year-round endeavor. And I will have obviously talked about this before because I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, I did a show, it would have been the show after the election, where I talked about the need to focus instead of on elections on the culture war. To focus on the bigger fights that conservatives need to win. Winning over pop culture, winning over Hollywood, winning over education, winning over minds rather than just winning at the ballot boxes. And I think that this is a message that ended up being very well received. The feedback I got from that show, from a column that I wrote about the subject in the Toronto Sun, it was extraordinarily positive. And I'm grateful for that. The fact is, I respect Canada's government system. I respect the fact that Justin Trudeau won lawfully and was sworn in lawfully and is now, for the next most likely 4 years, Canada's Prime Minister. I respect that as a procedural element. But here's the thing, and I said this to a few people, and I can't remember if I said it on the show or not. If Justin Trudeau was going to win, the best case scenario is him getting a majority. The best case scenario is the majority parliament that he ended up getting. And the reason why? Because now he has nowhere to hide. Now he has no excuses for not doing all the things that he said he was going to do to make things better for Canadians, to make things easier for Canadians. He can't blame the official opposition. He can't blame his coalition partners. He can't blame the fact that he was getting handicapped in the House of Commons. He has only himself and his caucus to whom he must answer. And for people who want a different vision for Canada than what he wants, this is great. Because it means that in 4 years, when he fails, because liberalism always fails, liberalism always fails at fixing the economy, liberalism always fails at making people more freer, liberalism always fails at managing the bureaucracy it claims to love so much. So when his policies fail, and make no mistake, they will, conservatives with a small c and conservatives with a big C need to be there to welcome the changing tides of the Canadian voters. Conservatives need to be there to welcome what will happen when people meet that realization. And that'll be a very, very interesting day. There will be a lot of eating crow, I imagine. And that's not to say that every liberal Canadian will open their eyes and say, oh, you know what, this has been wrong. This is not how we see things. But the sensible middle people, the people who decide to vote every election and don't have a standing ideology, they are the ones who will look at their paychecks, if they even have them, if they even have jobs anymore, and say, okay, maybe we need a different approach to this. Maybe that last guy wasn't as evil and monstrous as he was made out to be. Now, it's difficult for me because I can't actually remember the 2006 swearing in of Stephen Harper as well as I wish I did. I might actually go back and look it up because it's been interesting to see the media fawning over Justin Trudeau through the campaign, and that's been well documented. But the media is fawning over Justin Trudeau at his swearing in. I'm having trouble recalling whether or not that has always been the case, whether or not it's just genuinely a sense of pride and congratulations that the media has regardless of who's being sworn in. I'd venture a guess to say there's a little bit of it then, but I would also surmise that it's probably not as proud a moment as it was for Trudeau, looking back to seeing what Stephen Harper got when he went through this same process almost 10 years ago today. But as I've always said, I'm not here to beat you down. I'm not here to take away your hope and your positivity. I'm here to inspire and enlighten. So what are some of the good things we can point out here? What is the best part of this? Well, the point I mentioned earlier, I think, stands, that we're dealing with a prime minister who needs to be accountable in a greater way than anyone else because of his mandate, because of his majority. I also think that he'll quickly find that a lot of the things he wants to do are not possible. He will find that a lot of these things that he wants to commission, a lot of these things he wants to fund, simply cannot be done. His billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure funding, something we just don't have the money for. And, by the way, we never will. And then we look at other things that he's promised. He'll make good on a lot of them, like, for example, an inquiry on missing and murdered Aboriginal women. He can commission that easily. He'll never have to do anything with the results of it. It likely won't even yield anything of substance. What else is there? I mean, he's promised a lot of things on the defense front that will not be viable once he looks at the situation. And interestingly enough, even the centralized government that the left hated so much that the media criticized, Stephen Harper's PMO is so evil and so this and so that, and even that has not changed. Trudeau has had a very centralized, so far, Prime Minister's office, so much so that it's even responsible for staffing MPs' offices. They can't even hire their own staff based on a number of reports from Ottawa right now. But we're supposed to believe that he's going to be a bold departure. No, all of the things that the left hated so much about Stephen Harper, I think may have been there because they just made sense, not because there was any sort of secret agenda there, contrary to how amusing that would be for the media narrative to really further that idea. But I promised you some good news. So what else is there? Well, I think for starters, we need to recognize that governments change with the wind. And this is a point that I started making a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to get into more detail here. Governments are meant to change. They're meant to change every 4 years, 5 years. In the U.S., I mean, the House of Representatives changes every 2 years, as does the Senate. Their elections aren't every 2 years, but the makeup of the Senate can change every 2 years. And then you have the White House changing every 4 years, and it's been back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And even though Canada has sort of determined that the Liberal Party is the natural governing party, wait. The Liberal Party has determined, there we go, that it is the natural governing party of Canada. The fact is, people are fluid in their political allegiances and their political identities, which is why the culture battle is so important. And when we look at the root of what Canada's culture is, one thing that comes up a lot is this idea of freedom, this idea of valuing freedom and respecting freedom. And it was something I mentioned in my Sun Media column a couple of weeks ago. And there was actually a really interesting report that came out this week talking about freedom in Canada. And it was a report out of the United Kingdom's Legatum Institute. And the results were absolutely wonderful. Of the 142 countries that they assessed using internationally recognized data, looking at financial prosperity, looking at personal freedoms, looking at health and education, Canada is the most free country in the world. The most free country in the world is Canada. Now, this is obviously based on information before today. Will this change? I certainly hope not. And the other interesting one that I found to be wonderful was that Canada is the most tolerant country of immigrants and ethnic minorities and basically of other people who are not Canadians. And I don't think that Canada nor any country should ever make immigration its top priority. I think it's something you need to do smartly. And Jason Kenney, contrary to I think what a lot of people on the left and the right assume, brought in more people to this country per year than ever before. But the side of that I think is important here is that it shows how important political branding can be. Because even though, and this is a big one, but even though there were so many examples of Jason Kenney as Stephen Harper's former Minister of Immigration and Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, making Canada an open country to people who needed to come here or people who wanted to come here, there was still this belief permeating in the left and permeating in the media, I guess one and the same, that Stephen Harper hated minorities, hated immigrants, hated immigration. And then you look at the numbers that show, well, actually, Canada is the most tolerant of immigration. So, ha-ha. So what do these numbers really say, and what do they mean? Well, I wanted to get to the bottom of these, so I'm very pleased to welcome Nathan Gamester, the director of the Prosperity Index with the Legatum Institute, joining me from England. Nathan, it's great to have you on the show, sir. Thank you for your time today.
Andrew, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit, for those unfamiliar with the research that you've done, what was it you were actually looking at for this Prosperity Index?
Well, the idea behind the Prosperity Index is that the way we traditionally think about how successful countries are is too narrow. We tend to look at the success of countries by looking at a simple wealth measure, it's either GDP or GDP per capita. And of course that's important, but it excludes a lot of the factors that are also important. So if you look just at GDP, for example, then you miss, for example, how free countries are. You miss the quality of education and healthcare and various other things that I think you and I would probably intuitively understand and believe to contribute to a nation's prosperity and its success. And so the Prosperity Index aims to rectify that. We define prosperity broadly, and then we measure prosperity and we track it over time in our annual Prosperity Index.
I know when you're looking at something like wealth or growth of an economy, you can look at a lot of measures that are internationally recognized. When you're dealing with things like prosperity and freedom, do you run into difficulties by having a level of subjectivity there, or have you found a way to really look at it in a much more empirical way?
Well, the Prosperity Index is empirical in the sense that all of the data and the underlying methodology of the index is grounded in academic research. So we're not just sat around a table here in London deciding what we think should go into the index. So it's all grounded in decades of academic research. But the thing that sets the Prosperity Index apart from other similar tools is that we use both objective data and subjective data in order to determine our rankings. Let me give you an example of that. When we're measuring health, for example, we have a category in the index on health. We do look at all of the objective data that you would expect to be in a measure of health. So we look at things like life expectancy and infant mortality, and the number of hospital beds available in the country, and immunizations against infectious diseases, all of those kind of hard, objective health measures. But alongside that, we also include subjective measures of health. We ask citizens themselves how they're experiencing health in their country. Do they have health-related problems? Do they worry a lot? Or do they feel stressed a lot? And we ask these subjective questions and we put them alongside the objective data because we believe that prosperity is about not just the sort of the hard stats, but also about how people in countries are experiencing prosperity day to day. And so by combining those two types of data in the Prosperity Index, we believe that we're capturing a more comprehensive picture of prosperity compared to some of the other indexes and tools that are out there.
When you're looking at 142 countries, as I understand it, you're looking at things like governance, as you've mentioned, health, personal freedom, social capital, so quite a wide array of subject matter here. And, well, I don't think anyone would be surprised at which countries fared more poorly, a lot of third world nations, for example. I'm curious how difficult it was to get accurate data from countries like Chad and Burundi, which don't have, obviously, the infrastructure like some of the more developed nations on the list. That must have been quite an arduous task for the researchers.
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. You know, in developed Western economies, it's pretty easy to get hold of data. But for those countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world, they don't have, you know, official statistics agencies in those countries, and so it can be more tricky. But the way in which we derive our data for the Prosperity Index is we tend to take it from globally recognized institutions like the World Bank, like the World Health Organization, and other institutions like that. And the reason we do that, well, there are a couple of reasons, really. First of all, in order to produce comparable rankings, we need to take the data from the same source, if possible, so that it's comparable across the world. We can't just take data directly from government departments because different governments might measure the same thing in a slightly different way. And so we take it for comparability from organizations like the World Bank. But another reason is because the World Bank and those other organizations that I listed have their own standards of objectivity with the data that they're collecting. So we know that the data that we're using in the Prosperity Index has gone through rigorous tests in terms of its objectivity and its validity. So there's kind of a couple of reasons why we take the data from those global organizations and not directly from governments. And one final point on this is that there are some countries that we don't have data for and that we don't include in the index. And we could, for example, try and find alternative data sources for those countries. But what we want to do in order to ensure we have that comparability over time, we don't impute much data in the index. So if the data isn't available for the country, we simply don't include it in the index. And of course, that is a shame because we want to cover as many countries as possible. But at the same time, we also want to guarantee the quality of the data itself.
We're speaking with Nathan Gamester, director of the Prosperity Index at the Legatum Institute. Nathan, I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about Canada here because, well, we didn't make the top 5 for prosperity. We did fare pretty well, and where Canada did exceptionally well was being the most tolerant and the freest country in the world. So we can pat ourselves on the back about that later over here, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the freedom measure specifically and what put Canada where it ended up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you rightly say, in this year's rankings, Canada comes 6th overall, but first in our personal freedom category. And we quite liked that as a finding because we all know that there are country rivalries, and we know that your big neighbours, the US, like to call themselves the land of the free. And so we thought actually the finding that Canada comes top of the personal freedom category was something that might get a lot of interest.
And the US was number 15, if I'm not mistaken, on freedom, was it not?
That's correct. Yeah, very well put there. Just rubbing it into your neighbours in the US. There are a number of indicators that go into this category that we measure. For example, under personal freedom, we look at the level of tolerance for immigrants and ethnic minorities in a country. And for Canada specifically, when polled, citizens in Canada, 92% say that the country is very tolerant of immigrants. And a similar number, 92%, actually say that the country is tolerant of ethnic minorities. There's another data point that we use in that category, which is whether people are satisfied with the freedom that they have to choose the course of their lives. So kind of trying to get at how individuals in countries perceive their own levels of freedom. And in Canada, that number is 94%. So when polled, 94% of Canadians say that they're satisfied with their freedom of choice, and that's the 5th highest number in the world for that particular indicator.
Now, we had an election a couple of weeks ago, and our new prime minister is being sworn in tomorrow, so we're going to have a change in Canada politically. When you've looked at countries in the past and countries today, how much of a difference can, as an example, a new government give a country? Because I have to wonder if these things are more fluid or if these things are really ingrained in a country's culture, things like personal freedom and tolerance.
I think to some extent these things are ingrained in their culture, but any new government brings with it new policies. And so one of the interesting findings from this year's index is the fact that the UK economy has turned around. And the UK really, post-financial crisis, is showing huge increases in the economy category. And that, of course, is a result of government policy. And so we've seen the unemployment rate drop significantly in the UK, much faster than other European countries. And that's as a result of, we had a long period of Labour government here in the UK, and then the new government, the Conservative government that came in 5 or 6 years ago, has implemented new policies in order to get the economy going. But what I would say in terms of the Canadian political situation is that if you look across the rankings of the Prosperity Index, you're right, it does tell a positive story for the most part, but there are some areas where Canada is not perhaps performing as well as it could or indeed should. And so when you look, for example, at our entrepreneurship category, Canada ranks 15th globally. Now that in itself is a good ranking, but when you consider that it ranks first in some categories, second in others, ranking 15th for entrepreneurship might show that actually there's an area that the new government might like to start looking at and seeing if they can improve the rankings there.
Were there any big surprises for you globally when you saw the findings and saw where countries were ranking?
One of the findings that shot out from the index is that when you look over time, and I think the value in indexes like this is when you can look back over 5 years and 10 years and 15 years at what sort of the bigger trends are. One of those bigger trends that jumped out was the fact that Indonesia is the biggest improving country over the last 7 years.
Wow.
It increased by over 20 rankings over the last 7 years. And so that kind of shows if you get changes in rankings from year to year, that can tell you something. But actually, it's the longer term trends that I think are more interesting. And countries like Indonesia who are doing particularly well. And then conversely, you won't be surprised to hear that a country like Syria, for example, has been falling down the rankings steadily over the last few years. So it's those longer term trends that I think perhaps tell us most about the conditions in any given country. And
Rwanda, another one that I saw, has risen, I think, almost 20 places in the last 6 years.
Yes, again, a success story in terms of the Africa rankings for this year. So Rwanda, is doing very well. And, there's, as I say, we look at a number of different areas in the index. Rwanda ranks 101st overall this year, but has some very strong performances. So, for example, in the governance category, Rwanda ranks 48th overall, which is equivalent to a lot of developed, advanced Western economies. So there are some positive signs there for countries like Rwanda and indeed other sub-Saharan African countries.
Well, I look forward to holding up Canada's legacy now as the new land of the free with any luck in the future studies on this. Nathan Gamester joining me on the line, Director of the Prosperity Index at the Legatum Institute. Nathan, great to have you on the show from all the way over in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
It's great to talk to you. Thanks very much, and all the best.
Now, let's also clarify here, even though there is certainly an empirical data set that's being used there is some subjectivity. I don't think that a country that has socialized medicine forever can truly be the freest country in the world, but I also realize that's coming from a different view at freedom than what the report was looking at. But the fact of the matter is, all of this information, all of these accolades, all of these endorsements by a group that has nothing to do with the Conservatives, nor with Stephen Harper, is able to find these conclusions despite all of the things that are said about Stephen Harper, that people have no rights and scientists are muzzled and there's no free speech in Canada and you can't do this and you can't do this. And it's funny because as much as I've had criticisms about this, I guess now the past government, the former government under Stephen Harper, they were criticisms about them not being conservative enough. And I think that's interesting because I can still recognize that they were the best option at the time in Canada. And I look back at what that government accomplished and I'm happy with it. I'm proud of what they did. And if for no other reason, I'm happy that they were there to prevent what would have happened had someone else been there, what would have happened had Jack Layton been there, what would have happened had Michael Ignatieff been there, had Stéphane Dion been there, had Paul Martin been there. I'm happy that even if they didn't lift a finger, they still were there as placeholders so that the left could not do it. But I know they did a lot more. And Stephen Harper did a lot more than simply being a placeholder. Reduction in the GST, probably one of his earliest and most important accomplishments, and one that I don't think you'll ever see the clock turn back on because no government wants to be the one to say, okay, we're raising the sales tax now. We're making things more expensive for you. And especially with harmonized sales taxes in other provinces as well, like Ontario, it would be, I think, a little bit of an ordeal to do that. So what is the point of government, the point of politics? Well, it's serious. It's big. It's grand. Governments do a lot. But I think that we need to recognize here that things are not going to be as dramatic as we might like to think. Or maybe actually they're not as dramatic as we hate to think, but find ourselves thinking anyway. That's probably more likely to be the real way of looking at this thing. So what is the outcome here? Is Canada going to be a less free country in 4 years than today because of Justin Trudeau? I hope not. Anything can happen. There is a natural fluidity to the way that government works and the way that prime ministers can work. But my hope is that Canadians will start to realize, just as Americans have under George W. Bush's time, who hated him. And then a few years later, that famous "Miss Me Yet" meme goes viral because people realize, oh my goodness, maybe I didn't understand how this whole thing works. Maybe I just didn't understand the importance of what was being done in that time. And by the way, Bush is another president that I wouldn't put down on the list of best presidents in the world, but I recognize the importance and significance of a lot of what he did, and more importantly, of having him there instead of Gore, for example, or instead of Kerry, for example. That's where it's very important, even if you have an imperfect politician, to have one in office or have a lawmaker who is not the other guy. It sounds petty, but it's very important if you look at how much you can do in a short period of time. And this will be interesting for Ontario listeners, and I don't want to bore everyone who's outside of Ontario, but for Ontario listeners, it'll be very interesting to see what happens after Kathleen Wynne leaves. Because look, Patrick Brown, the former Conservative MP, now the PC leader in Ontario, may well be the next premier. And I've known Patrick for years. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy. And I think he'll do a lot of good things here. But what I find fascinating about his sort of path forward is that he will be campaigning on new ideas for sure, but he'll also be campaigning on things that Kathleen Wynne has done that are bad, that are wrong, that are terrible. How much of his legacy does he want to spend tearing down things that she did? Tearing down programs of her government. Most of them, I think, deserve to go. And I won't list them all, but just as an example, I mean, e-testing is one thing that government could get rid of. A lot of the changes she's made to healthcare and education. Again, very big things that could be rolled back. But how much does any new leader want to go in and start turning back the clock on other people? So I look at what the Liberals are going to do, for example. They haven't said that they're going to take back the long gun registry or bring it back. In fact, they've specifically said they won't. But they have promised more controls and more restrictions for law-abiding firearms owners, like a return to the old ATT system, which will be something that is inconsequential in impacting gun crime, violent crime, or even any sort of crime whatsoever. All it is just telling people they need to go through hoops to carry a piece of paper that they're authorized to carry anyway. And we look at other changes as well, where I don't know how much of Trudeau's first few months in office he wants to spend changing things that Stephen Harper did. My prediction will be that he'll realize it's easier just to let things slide the way they are. And we may say that shows a weakness of character, but I think it also means that we're going to be stuck with someone in 4 years that's going to be doing the same thing, which is nothing, just building on what government has already done to expand itself. Anyway, so I'm sure we'll have lots to say about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the weeks and months and years to come. But for now, we're going to move on, cover some other stuff here. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
We are back here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. And, okay, I got to eat my words a little bit here. I have to break a promise. I said I was going to move on from the election coverage, but there's another story I wanted to share with you very briefly before we do that. And I guess it's not even election coverage now. It's government coverage, the post-government analysis, the nation's post-mortem, I think is probably more accurate. But this one is about the new minister responsible for science. You see, I just can't keep a straight face on this one, nor a straight voice. So the new minister responsible for science is a woman by the name of Kirsty Duncan. Now, she's not a rookie on the scene. She's been involved in politics and in the Liberal Party for quite a while. She has a PhD in geography. She was the Liberal Party's environment critic, and she was also at one point vice chair of the Parliament of Canada's Environment Committee. Now, the reason I share all this with you is to talk about the fact that she is obviously very interested in environmental issues. Now, she was not given Minister of the Environment, but she was given Minister responsible for science. So the recently re-elected MP for Etobicoke North, Kirsty Duncan, is the minister replacing Ed Holder, who is actually the minister who was once my member of Parliament, the Minister of State responsible for science and technology. Now, what's interesting here is that she has a little bit of an interesting blight on her resume that I wanted to share with you. Now, this has been getting a little bit of coverage on Twitter and social media, mainly because I was trying to spark it. And I'm glad that it's picking on. But it was actually a 2-year-old report that I had recalled on nofrackingconsensus.com, which, if nothing else, is just an absolutely wonderful URL. But it was talking about her former Twitter bio, or her former Facebook bio, rather. You see, on her Facebook page, going back a couple of years, her Member of Parliament Facebook page, underneath the section where it is asking for basic info, she says Nobel Peace Prize laureate for her work on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, first off, I would never support any politician that knowingly aligns themselves with the IPCC, regardless of whether it's rightfully so or wrongfully so. But to say that you have inherited, I don't know, by osmosis, your Nobel Peace Prize because of another organization is a tad disingenuous. She's not the only one to lay claim to being a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. Warren Kinsella also called her the only Nobel Prize recipient in Canada's House of Commons. She's been introduced in interviews as a Nobel-winning climate scientist. But as is relayed at No Fracking Consensus, neither of the claims is true. Yes, she does have scientific credentials. Yes, she does have a PhD. And that aside, she was involved with the IPCC. She wrote or contributed to one section of one report that was used by the IPCC. And she was, by the way, in a team of 39 people in doing so, and part of an organization, not part of the actual IPCC. So here we have a woman who is trading off of a prize that she does not have and trading off of a reputation she did not deserve, and not even a good one at that. I mean, the IPCC findings that got them the Nobel Prize, not the Nobel Prize for Science, by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize, because, this is what you get when you're talking about a political issue rather than a scientific issue or an environmental issue like man-made global warming. But I find it to be interesting, and there's actually a great bit more detail, or was, at a website set up called fakenobellaureates.com. And I'm glad that people are actually starting to talk about this now. Like I said, I mean, it's a light story, but it's kind of amusing, because so many people hammered the former minister, Ed Holder, saying, well, he's a climate change denier and blah, 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 blah. And when I heard that, I said, I wish. I mean, I never heard him make any comments on the record about that. They would have made me like him more than I already did even. But now we have someone who is conjuring up made-up titles for herself in an effort to look more politically viable. And hey, it worked. Look at the cabinet appointment she just got this week. We've got to take a break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media, hosted by Nobel Peace Prize winning, award-winning, PhD holding Andrew Lawton. Yours truly. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back to the program. Okay, now I'm going to make good on my promise. Get away from Canada's post-mortem here, where I remind you I will be and make this a point in a concerted effort to be the unofficial official opposition to this government. And I will do so proudly and with honor for you, the good people of Canada who probably didn't vote to put this mess in. So you shouldn't have to deal with what's going to happen next. I wanted to talk a little bit this segment about drugs, and maybe that is actually part of Canada's postmortem now, but the question of addiction versus choice, illness versus choice. And then we get into simply the more libertarian question of whether or not the state should be able to impose a ban on any sort of illegal drugs. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because there have actually been a couple of stories, one taking place in Ireland and the other actually taking place here in Canada, that both speak to different sides of this question. And I was actually going to talk about both of them. And then I realized, just because I had filed them in my mind in different places, I realized when I was putting the show together today that they're actually really sharing the same theme. So I figured I would put them together, and we'll see how it goes anyway. The one example that actually prompted this was a lawsuit that's been filed against the province of Ontario fighting the organ transplant rules. The woman who is the plaintiff in the case is a Toronto woman named Deborah Selkirk, and she lost her husband, Mark, who died of liver failure. Now, he was an alcoholic, and that was integral to, in her eyes, why he died. He needed a new liver, or a piece of someone else's liver that could then regenerate into a full liver, and he didn't get it. Because there is a law in Ontario that is shared in similar form with other provinces that says you must be dry for 6 months to be eligible for a transplant. Now, not only does this apply to a transplant on a list, but also to a family member wanting to donate and give you a liver. So that I find particularly interesting here, because when most people hear of a case like this and hear of a man being turned down, it's like, yeah, well, why should he get this liver when someone else won't abuse their body? That's the way people look at this. And in this particular case, it's simply a matter of someone else willingly giving their liver just for him. So no one got that liver otherwise. So was he by definition discriminated against for alcoholism? Yes. And he was discriminated against, and it was in the eyes of his widow based on an illness, based on a disease. Alcoholism is an addiction. I don't think you can really fight or dispute that there is, in fact, a level of illness or sickness to people dealing with that. Did it start with a choice? Maybe. Do you need to choose to get out of it? Absolutely. Can you do it without help? I'm sure everyone is going to give you a different answer to that, depending on their own experiences. Now, that's all besides the point here, because the root of this is, to me, not a question of whether or not alcoholics should be able to get liver transplants. The question is whether or not the government is right to impose lifestyle choices on us and use healthcare as a means to do it. Because that is what's actually happening here. And you know what? We're actually seeing something similar in Ireland, where the government is actually going the opposite direction. They're decriminalizing drug use. Heroin, cocaine, cannabis for personal use, so not trafficking. And they're doing it because they think that, look, what if you're using these and you're an addict, we need to help you. And in order to help you, we can't be putting you through the justice system for no particular reason and not really making the country or the streets in the country any safer. So they've said, okay, we're going to offer health care if you want it. If you don't, that's fine. And you get to make, again, that choice. And it's an interesting one because I have gone back and forth on this. I have. And this is where I remind people that I'm a conservatarian. Libertarians think I'm too conservative. Conservatives think I'm too libertarian. So I am politically lonely, such as the case may be. And it's funny because people will email me all the time from this podcast and other appearances I do and say, I thought you were a Christian. How dare you support the legalizing of this and this and this? And my response is that, look, I'm sorry to disappoint you. And I'm not actually sorry to disappoint people, but I don't like that you think I've betrayed you or betrayed my faith. The fact of the matter is I am a Christian. I choose as a Christian to live my life in a certain way. As a conservatarian, if you will, I hope that name can gain steam, by the way, I choose not to impose my religious values on other people. I believe in the most absolute forms of freedom we can find and derive in society without allowing people to harm one another physically. And that's basically the dividing line here. So when you talk about an issue like gay marriage, I am indifferent. I don't like the idea of having a ban on marriage of any kind when, look, it's something that only has an argument rooted in religion. Abortion is the one thing that people will throw out as a spoiler. Say, oh, well, how can you be pro-life and support banning abortion? I say easily, because there's someone else involved. It is a violation of someone else's right to life. And I don't want to get into those issues here. I'm trying to lay out my political position for you as best as I can so that when we're talking about drugs, as much as I don't like the idea of heroin on the streets, as much as I don't like the idea of cocaine on the streets, as much as I don't like the idea of these hard drugs being used, I recognize that they already are. I recognize on the flip side, though, that if we legalize them, then the biggest problem is that we're going to have a government heroin bureaucracy, which is going to be like the LCBO or any other provincial liquor boards, but worse. You're going to have to get like only the government heroin, which I can't imagine is going to be as good as the stuff you get on the street. So I think there are legitimate grievances we can have about the process of how to legalize drugs. So maybe decriminalizing is the best way to go. There was a movement by, and I can't remember the name of the police force. It started off by one, I'm pretty sure in Massachusetts, a couple of months ago, where the police department had a policy that it was directing on its own that said if you are a drug user and you want to seek treatment, you can come in, give your drugs, your paraphernalia, everything you have, no questions asked, no arrests, no charges, and they'll put you into treatment. They will pay for you to go to rehab. And they said the rules don't apply if you are arrested while committing a crime and they find drugs on you, you'll be charged. But if you make the choice, and there's where we get to that C word, then they will help you and they will do it. And they're doing this for their own purposes because they're saying it's resulting in better public health. It lowers policing costs in the long run and so on and so forth. So again, even if you recognize that illnesses and addictions are one and the same, or I guess addictions are part of illnesses, you can still recognize the need to have a level of personal responsibility there. And when we get to the other side of this, going back to how we started off with the state enforcing this, this is where we get to a bit of a concerning territory. Alcohol is legal. It is legal to be drunk. It is legal to be drunk every day. It is legal to be an alcoholic. And some would say it's even fun to be an alcoholic, although I don't think many of them would. So for the state to say, we are going to deny you health care that you have paid for. And by the way, if you're an alcoholic in Ontario, you've paid probably more for your health care than anyone else has with how much the LCBO is charging for your booze. So you have paid for this health care, but you are being denied it because of something that is a disease. And even if it's not a disease, something that you've decided to do. If someone is willingly offering you up a piece of their liver and you are willingly going to receive it, who's the government to say no? Their argument is that, well, it's less likely to work and we're footing the bill. But then we get into the question of why don't we allow the government to do this in other ways? Oh, you're a smoker? Okay, you're going to the back of the line for lung cancer treatment. Oh, you're obese and you had a heart attack. Well, sorry, you shouldn't have had so many cheeseburgers. We're not putting you in. When I had my stroke back in 2009, I'm sure there were lifestyle factors that had contributed to it, although, in fact, most of sort of the reports and results I got traced back to a heart disease. But even then, did they say, all right, you're good for treatment, but yeah, Tom over there who had his fourth Big Mac before lunch, he doesn't get help. What else? Where do we draw the line? Extreme stunt drivers. Hey, your job led to this happening. You're a dirt biker, you got into an accident? No, you chose to do that, we're not doing it. The only things we're going to be covering eventually are freak accidents. And even then, I'm sure the government will find someone else to blame. So once we start auditing lifestyles for healthcare, we're getting out of the mandate of what this so-called universal coverage is supposed to be. Now, I don't have a problem with auditing healthcare. I don't have a problem with doing risk assessments. In fact, I think it should be encouraged. But I think it should be done by private insurance companies, not by one state health insurance monopoly, which is what happens in provinces across Canada. So I actually, as much as I am this tough love kind of person, and I try to be as pragmatic as I can, I actually disagree with the 6-month ban on getting a liver. Even if you get the liver and ruin it, even if you do that, why is it any of the government's business? If they had an option to go to a private provider in Canada, then I'd say, okay, great, you guys had your choice, you didn't take it. But why is the government getting involved in this when it shouldn't? And Marnie Supkoff in the National Post had a great piece about this. Now, she's the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and she actually challenged my own position on this because I was actually on the fence about it. And this was when it came up the last time. And she had written something about a similar case. And then when I saw this one, it was sort of that final blow of, yeah, this is actually a really good way of looking at things here. She says that they should be struck down as unconstitutional. And she was writing about the lawsuit. And she says that the 6-month rule is not necessary. She says, I shudder at the potential logical outcomes of rationing healthcare based on how much some politician or bureaucrat feels a patient deserves to live. Since hard drug users contribute to their own physical demise, should they too be denied medical resources that could be devoted to more blameless patients? Do car accident victims who are wearing seatbelts get triaged in the emergency room before car accident victims who flouted the law? What if their injuries are equally serious? What if the seatbelt wearers weren't as badly hurt? Does this not quickly become an exercise in passing moral judgment rather than making medical decisions about saving lives? And what of the significant role genetic predisposition is said to play in alcoholic liver disease? Have we decided it's necessary to punish individuals who have inherited this particular physical weakness, but not, say, those with a family history of diabetes, whose condition similarly depends on lifestyle choices? Unquote. She says later on that not judging is a well-intentioned concept that can be taken too far. And I was reminded of a case that I read about. This was a few years ago now. It was a death row inmate who had had some life-saving medical treatment given 2 months or so before the person was set to be executed. And the rationale was, look, even though you're sentenced to death, the fact of the matter is you are under our care. We have not decided we're going to execute you yet. And if you are sick, we are going to treat you because this is our obligation. And when we look at universal health care, which is a failed system, but still the system we have, and I think we need to play within the parameters of that, how can we start picking and choosing based on merit who is going to live? Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not one of these people that thinks this is going to be all part of the New World Order and the government's going to start using this to start managing and manipulating populations. It's not anything like that, although some people would probably think that wasn't a terrible idea. It's not like, Trudeau has his gender parity. Now we're going to have our healthcare parity. Sorry, sir, we already treated 4 women today. You're 4 men today, so you're good to go. We're going to treat all the women now. But what we are going to see here, what we are going to deal with here, because we'll have to, is a rationing based not on who needs medical treatment, how badly, and when. So when we look at policies that we have towards vices, alcohol, tobacco, fast food, drugs, I don't see how there's any way to deal with these things but from a libertarian perspective. We can incorporate education, but even then, given how much science can change and how drastically and how quickly, I'm not even sure that the state can effectively educate people. I mean, the Canada Food Guide has been discredited, but still we're dealing with basically a system that the government is teaching and hawking all over the place. So I'm not even sure the government can educate effectively, and I know we spoke about that with John Robson quite a while ago on this very podcast. So what is the role of the government in these things? If you get your hands off of the vices, and obviously some regulation is needed, and this is where libertarians find I'm too conservative, because I'm not one of these people that believes in this absolute sort of anarchy that, Breaking Bad could be a model for every young man's life. I'm going to grow up and I'm going to start, growing my own drug lab and all that sort of stuff. But what we are, I think, looking at here is a country that is likely to legalize marijuana. And the argument will be based on, in a lot of ways, well, it's not as unhealthy as things like tobacco and alcohol, and therefore there's no reason we should ban it. And then, as much as people dislike the slippery slope argument, I think that in 10 years, 20 years, we will have the inevitable discussion of, well, why ban other drugs then? Why not ban, or why not release the ban on heroin, on cocaine, on crack, on meth, on LSD, on whatever other drugs there are? I'm ashamed to say that I know very little about this area. Why not release those things then? Because it has nothing to do with the health benefits. No one's saying, well, marijuana is actually good for you, that's why we should legalize it. No, it's that it's a good way to score political points from people that don't care about the law anyway. I highly doubt that more people are going to smoke pot because it's legal when that happens in Canada. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that'll be one of Justin Trudeau's first broken promises, when he realizes that he can't do the outright legalization as seamlessly and as easily as he thinks he can. But hey, maybe he'll prove me wrong on that. I don't disagree with legalizing marijuana. I just don't care about it as much as people seem to. Maybe that's my problem. I mean, this seems to be like the ballot issue for so many people who love Doritos. And here we are having the discussion even today about whether or not we should go the route of places like Ireland and open things up even further. So we've got to take a quick break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online. You're listening to Andrew Lawton here on TheRebel.Media.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
We are back here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. I am going to do something that I've never done on this podcast before. I'm going to read almost all of a column. I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to read a great deal of it because it's one of these things where so much of it is important and is integral to the point, and I feel if I just take an excerpt out, I am doing you a disservice. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background in just a moment here. What is at stake here is the quality and caliber of education. This is written from an American perspective, but has an incredibly potent message for Canadians as well, and you'll no doubt be aware of this. This is about all that we're seeing in terms of the dilution of education and the wussification of education, and the political correctnessization of education. And I apologize for a conjugation that may not be rooted in a proper English there. It's a column written by someone who has done the unthinkable. They've tried to rock academia in a way that is desperately needed. The author of the piece is actually a professor who has decided to urge students to shake whatever preconceptions they have about the way campus is supposed to be, and he's shaking up campus in the process. And he wrote his remarks down that he's given after the fact, and he wants other professors to take heed of this. His name's Mike Adams. He's a criminology professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And the column he wrote in Town Hall, which went viral this week, has actually done, I think, exactly what he wanted to do, which was to remind his students, but everyone, that things don't have to be this way. So he starts off with an introduction, preambles what he's saying a little bit. I have to read this line because it's a joke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read select excerpts from his piece, and I will make sure that we have a link to the actual piece when the podcast goes up if you want to read it in full. He writes, "I'm talking about the growing minority of students who believe they have a right to be free from being offended. If we don't reverse this dangerous trend in our society, there will soon be a majority of young people who will need to walk around in plastic bubble suits to protect them in the event that they come into contact with a dissenting viewpoint. That mentality is unworthy of an American. It's hardly worthy of a Frenchman. Let's get something straight right now. You have no right to be unoffended. You have a right to be offended with regularity. It is the price you pay for living in a free society. If you don't understand that you are confused, and dangerously so, in part, I blame your high school teachers for failing to teach you the basic civics before you got your diploma. Most of you went to public high schools, which are a disaster. Don't tell me that offended you. I went to a public high school. Of course, your high school might not be the problem. It's entirely possible that the main reason why so many of you are confused about free speech is that piece of paper hanging on the wall right over there. Please turn your attention to that ridiculous document that's framed and hanging by the door. In fact, take a few minutes to read it before you leave class today. It is our campus speech code. It specifically says there is a requirement that everyone must only engage in discourse that is respectful. That assertion is as ludicrous as it is illegal. I plan to have that thing ripped down from every classroom on campus before I retire." He then talks about his grandfather serving in World War I, his step-grandfather serving in World War II, fighting for free speech. He says this ban on disrespectful speech is really only illusory. The university that created these speech restrictions then turns around and sponsors plays like the Vagina Monologues, which is loaded with profanity, including the C word. the most offensive and disrespectful word a person could ever apply to a woman. It is pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. So the university position can be roughly summarized as follows. Public university administrators have a First Amendment right to use disrespectful profanity, but public university students do not. This turns the First Amendment on its head. The university has its free speech analysis completely backwards, and that's why they need to be sued. He talks about coming to class on time, turning off their cell phones, not talking during lectures. He talks about the fact that one student once complained to a chairwoman in his department that his mention of God was a violation of the separation of church and state. He talks a little bit about history, but he said, if you are stupid enough to think that the Declaration of Independence is unconstitutional, because it mentions God, absolutely. He said, I'm going to ask you to do exactly 3 things and do them in the exact order that I specify. Number 1, get out of my class. He explains why. Number 2, withdraw from the university. If you find that you are actually relieved because you will no longer be in a class where your beliefs might be challenged, then you aren't ready for college. Go get a job building houses so you can work with some illegal aliens who will help you gain a better appreciation of what this country has to offer. Finally, if this doesn't work, I would ask you simply to get the hell out of the country. The ever-growing thin-skinned minority you have joined is simply ruining life in this once great nation. Please move to some place like Cuba, where you can enjoy the company of communists and get excellent health care. Just hop on a leaky boat and start paddling your way towards utopia. You will not be missed. Thank you for your time. I'll see most of you when classes resume on Monday. Slow clap, fast clap for this man now, Mike Adams, at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. A hero in academia, and actually someone who reminds me of a professor I had in political science when I was at university who was a closet conservative. But the funny thing was about my conversations with him, and he would never speak the way he spoke to me publicly, which was quite unfortunate. But he was an NDP supporting socialist. He was one of these people that thought in big government and thought in socialized healthcare and thought about all of these different things that the left just loves. And he probably still does to some extent. But what turned him was university culture. What turned him was being passed over for promotions and tenure by underqualified, unqualified female minorities, because the schools needed to fill their quotas. So affirmative action, which is alive and well mostly in academic institutions and in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, of course, was hurting him. So he saw firsthand the effect that all of these, do-gooders were having. And then beyond that, he was seeing a problem of censorship. He was seeing a problem of the wussification of university students, of university policies, of student council, this self-importance that led to this demise of debate. And this is going back years now. He said he had been seeing this since back in the 80s. So this started for him anyway, the way he relayed it to me, a shift, not to the right, but a shift towards a pragmatic perspective. A very pragmatic perspective that I think is going to do more to convert people than anything else. It's like when I talked about earlier about the culture war. I mean, people start noticing things when they are affecting them more directly. And ultimately, this is a very valuable thing to note for us who are trying to basically bring people around to a certain way of thinking or way of viewing the world, reminding them that, hey, once things start biting people in their own rear end, they start to realize why maybe these policies aren't as great as they once thought. But my goodness, if you're looking to do university education outside of this country, please make sure you go to North Carolina and take this man's class. It'll be worth whatever they charge you for your tuition. That was at townhall.com. Certainly a must-read in the full context and full form. We've got to take a break here. More Lawton Online when we come back in just a couple of moments. Stay tuned.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, you heard the man, scouring every corner of the globe from Alberta to Algeria. I was almost using Armenia. I think we used that one recently. And you know what? Bahrain to Beirut, we find the stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved in them. And today there actually is very much a liberal involved in them, and his name is Bernie Sanders. But I assure you, it's not exactly a story about Bernie Sanders. It's about a company in Vermont that has decided to start selling underwear with a black and white drawing of the Democratic presidential candidate on the actual garment. The underwear, which features the message, "Feel the Burn," burn spelt B-E-R-N, is available for men and women, so it's unisex, $15 a pair, plus shipping and handling. The workers are not clothing manufacturers that started the company. No, they're actually employees of a government affairs firm, and they thought it would make a good, fun side business. This is because on TV and on talk shows, he said that he prefers briefs over boxers. Now, I don't know how on earth this was coming up in interviews. I've interviewed Stephen Harper 3 times. I've interviewed Thomas Mulcair twice. I've interviewed Justin Trudeau once, and not once have I ever thought to ask what kind of underwear they wear. But hey, maybe I've been missing the real story here. But they've decided to do this. They call his passion for serious issues admirable, and they say that the political process has benefited from his campaign. They are not, by the way, the winners of It Must Be a Liberal. The winners of It Must Be a Liberal are anyone who buys this, because only a liberal, I could assure you, would want Bernie Sanders' face anywhere near their crotch. So I think it's safe to say that if you want a pair of Bernie Sanders underwear and you want to feel the burn, I can think of no other explanation than that you indeed must be a liberal. There's really no other way. Folks, we've got to wrap things up for the program today, but when we come back next week, lots more Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.